He stood vigilant through the latter century of the 41st millennium, his life spanning over 200 Terran years by the time he was summoned to service during the 13th Black Crusade. Imperial propaganda vaunted him as a paragon of heroism as the 41st millennium waned, though by his own admission his primary focus remained on his personal preservation throughout his extensive career. Distinct among his brethren of the Imperial Commissariat, Cain was loath to squander the lives of his charges needlessly should it not assure his own survival, and he held little regard for the rigid enforcement of military discipline. Cain exerted every effort to shirk participation in actual combat engagements, yet ironically maintaining his facade as the hero of the Imperium necessitated his involvement in perilous situations far beyond his preference. Throughout his tenure, he was accountable for numerous victorious campaigns and retired to impart his knowledge upon the future Imperial Commissars at the Schola Progenium. Commissar Cain was a complex character. His many great deeds were often accompanied by a notably uninspired visage. The saga of Cain was fraught with tumult. He chose his inaugural post, the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery, with a singular purpose: to eschew the front lines of battle. For artillery regiments are oft found in the rearguard of any imperial force, capable of delivering death to the enemy from a respectful distance. Should their volley of destruction prove insufficient, the likelihood of prioritization for evacuation was substantially increased for such units. However, post the events on Desolatia, Cain found his commanders increasingly inclined to dispatch him into lethal engagements, solely by virtue of his heroic stature. To find himself in the afterlife, even adorned in full regalia, was a fate Cain fervently wished to avoid. His paramount concern was always his own preservation, navigating the often precarious and invariably perilous situations with which he was confronted. Despite his reluctance to partake in combat, Cain was far from incapable of administering a resolute thrashing to Xenos or heretics. Within the hallowed halls of the Schola Progenium, not only were physical regimens rigorously adhered to, but also martial training under the tutelage of the most lethal instructors, a forging process that tempered any recruit. He was described by his contemporaries as an exceptional swordsman, a skill respected even by the Astartes, a skill doubtlessly honed through combat experience unmatched by any mere practice, proclaimed Inquisitor Vale. Indeed, his skills were honed until the end. In his memoirs, he describes the mastery of the chainsword as habitual and instinctual. Cain possessed a significant social acuity, which he employed throughout his career to fortify his public persona as a hero of the Imperium. His profound understanding of practical psychology led to considerably weaker discipline among the ranks than would befit the charges of an Imperial Commissar. For instance, the Valhallan Guardsmen, inherently accustomed to cold climates, were granted certain leniencies in their combat attire to prevent them from drenching in sweat on tropical worlds. Cain always sought ways to avoid executing soldiers, which in the eyes of some deprived himself of a considerable portion of pleasure that came with being a commissar, choosing instead to issue friendly warnings rather than outright punishments. Cain acknowledged this was to cultivate popularity and provide the guardsmen with an incentive to try and preserve his valuable life. Without just cause, his regiments maintained high morale, not compromising discipline or combat efficiency. At the dawn of the 42nd millennium, his memoirs were published among the ranks of the Inquisition. They were sequestered by the Order of the Inquisition and preserved as an archive for Inquisitor Amberley Vale of the Ordo Xenos, with whom Cain had encountered numerous times throughout his career, developing close professional and personal relations. Vale meticulously annotated the notes of Cain, drawing upon additional sources such as the memoirs of Valhallan General Genit Sulla, published and made available solely to the Inquisition's internal eyes. It is noteworthy that Inquisitor Vale, in her annotations throughout the memoirs, remarks on Cain's propensity for deceit. However, she observes that his narrative is substantially truthful regarding his shortcomings and, in Vale's own words, unduly modest in recounting his victories against the enemies of the Imperium. Cain frequently alludes to his native hive world, though he never divulges its name or any distinguishing characteristic that might enable its accurate identification. Nonetheless, the Commissar exhibits a certain affinity for subterranean passageways and possesses a natural sense of direction underground, which would later aid in forging camaraderie with the Valhallan ice warriors. He contends that his parents fell in service to the Imperial Guard, leading to his conscription into the training for commissariat. His record at the Schola Progenium, where he was educated and prepared, reveals that Ciaphas's grades were low across virtually all disciplines except for athletics and combat training. Moreover, he maintained an exemplary disciplinary record, which perhaps signifies only that he was seldom apprehended or reprimanded for improper conduct. Throughout his tenure within the commissariat of the Imperial Guard, Cain seemingly served chiefly with the regiments drawn from the ice world of Valhalla. He adopted numerous of their customs, save for their peculiar fondness for the cold, which they relished, and their habit of partaking in showers of frigid water. This proved beyond his endurance. Commissar Cain's faithful aide was Jurgen, a Valhallan guardsman who ultimately revealed himself to be a psychic blank, and served Cain loyally for many years. Cain commenced his service within the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery as a commissar attached to the command battery, but soon undertook duties across the entire regiment. His first experience of combat occurred on the world of Desolatia, where the regiment held off orcs, only to soon confront a tyrannid hive fleet. They battled until the arrival of the Imperial fleet, which evacuated the armed forces from the planet. Following this, Cain and his regiment were dispatched to the planet Kefir, where he spent several tranquil years. The only significant battle in which he participated was aiding local law enforcement in rooting out a Genestealer infestation in the sector and assisting in the protection of the Adeptus Arbites headquarters. Yet, compared to previous engagements, this was hardly comparable. From Kefir, Cain journeyed to the world of Purlia. After a space battle, he and his adjutant Jurgen were left isolated on Purlia's surface, following their escape pods crash landing behind Orc lines. In that forsaken crucible, it was Cain who rallied the survivors, embarking upon what would later be known as the Liberator's March, cutting a swathe through the Xeno battle lines back to the Imperial front, culminating in the slaying of an Orc warlord with his own hands. This act sparked the final rout of the disoriented and fragmented green-skinned horde. In the dystopian world of Slaukenberg, Cain and a trio of guardsmen nearly fell prey to the machinations of a chaos sorcerer while escorting scouts from the regiment, yet they managed to obliterate the enemy's positions with a precision artillery strike. Thenceforth, Cain was assigned to the Commissariat Command for several years, a tenure that initially promised simplicity, yet his reputation as a gambler with fate turned this into a cruel jest. Even there, perilous missions were his portion, including ventures into Interitus Prime, a Necron tomb world, Viridia and Viridia Secundus, the purging of a space hulk, confrontations against the craft world Eldari, the purification of the world of Sanguia, and the campaign to reclaim the archipelago. He survived these campaigns solely by the skin of his teeth, always finding timely refuge to conceal himself, frequently emerging as the sole survivor. Far from disconcerting the command echelon, this trait merely amplified his legend, casting him as the last hero standing against the tide of darkness. Eventually, he requested reassignment back to a frontline unit of the regiment, deeming it ironically safer than his commissions within the Commissariat's command. Presently, the bulk of the archives on Cain recount his service with the 597th Valhallan Regiment, bearing testimony to a saga steeped in the blood and valour that are the currency of the Imperium's endless war. In the times of his service within this regiment, it appeared that Cain was remarkably close to the soldiers, with a special camaraderie amongst the senior officers, with whom he shared personal bonds of fellowship. It can be said that Cain himself was instrumental in forging a battalion from the united remnants of the 301st and 296th Valhallan regiments. One composed entirely of males, the other of females. Harbouring strong mutual animosity, A rebellion ignited within the mess hall, culminating in the demise of several among the regiment's ranks and a handful of crew members aboard the transport war vessel. Cain took decisive action, appealing to the administratum for the regiment's rechristening as the 597th Valhallan Regiment, a sum of 296 and 301, symbolising their origins, whilst reinforcing the unity of the combined regiment. Cain was adamant in the integration of squads from both regiments and appointed various commendations for notable conduct and performance. This practice swiftly transformed the units into a unified and disciplined force, a stature they maintained even after Cain's departure from the regiment. Ciaphas Cain served in the 597th Valhallan Regiment of the Astra Militarum during the incident on Gravelax, where he was bestowed the Order of Merit of Gravelax, 2nd class, for his role in thwarting the Tau Empire's annexation of the planet Gravelax on the eastern fringes of the Imperium. Cain would jest in the years to follow that had he allowed the Tau to slay Governor Grice, the grateful populace might have awarded him the first-class decoration. Verily, the sphere had come under the corrupt influence of a Genestealer cult, seeking to ignite a futile conflict over a forsaken orb between the Tau and the Imperium, thereby diverting their gaze from the encroaching shadow of a tyrannid hive fleet. In the midst of these tumultuous events, Cain first crossed paths with Inquisitor Amberley Vale and uncovered that his aide, Jurgen, was in fact a psychic blank. This singular trait would later prove to be Cain's salvation. The campaign reached its zenith with the slaying of Governor Grice, unveiled as a cult adherent through the actions of Inquisitor Vale and the subsequent retreat of Tau martial contingents from Gravelax. In the year that followed, his duty took him to the world of Simia Orichalcae, defending an oil refinery from the savage orcs and a reawakening threat of the Necrons beneath the ice. Soon thereafter, he was dispatched to the planet Periramunda. Following a civil uprising, it was unveiled that Genestealers had orchestrated the rebellion. After numerous fierce engagements, the infection was thoroughly purged, having confronted the Xenos Hrud on Skekwi and orcs on Castafor. Cain ventured to Adumbria in 937, M41, where he played a crucial role in unveiling a chaos ritual and repelling the landed forces of chaos. His valour led to the downfall of a demon prince and thwarted the planet's transformation into a demon world. The Valhallan 597th was summoned in 938, M41 to assist in the pacification of Lentonia. A sinister plague swept through the world, infecting the ranks of the guard and the local populace alike, and those slain by it rose from their graves to assail the living. Efforts to forge a vaccine bore fruit in the sterility of the laboratory, yet faltered grievously upon administration to the afflicted. Cain observed with marked curiosity that Jurgen's wounds were utterly vanquished, while those who sustained even lesser gashes from the claws met death's embrace. Ciaphas discerned that the plague harboured both a physiological and a psychogenic component. Being a psychic blank, Jurgen was shielded from the latter's malign influence. Thus his wounds healed as if by the Emperor's grace. At his behest, certain vaccines were sanctified, vastly magnifying their potency. Upon the moment of loading these blessed concoctions into artillery ordnance aimed at the renegade forces, Cain and Jurgen stumbled upon a Nurglite chaos cult that puppeteered the Revenants and annihilated it. In the year 942, M41 Cain and the Valhallan 597th were tasked with quelling a tumult of orc aggression on Nusquam Fundamentibus, a forsaken ice world on the fringes of the main thoroughfares, a site where Cain had ventured upon a mission 2 decades prior. Amidst the icy desolation, Cain unveiled the presence of a tyrannid brood lying in dormant slumber for eons, assuredly predating the Imperial era and certainly long before the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth within the eternal frost of the planet. The swarm was partially roused by the planet's disturbances, yet the hive mind was obliterated before it could achieve full operational might, largely thanks to Cain's valour. In the midst of the 900 SM-41, Cain vacated his regimental commission, ascending to serve as commissarial liaison officer upon the staff of Lord General Zivan, guardian and overseer of the Emperor's divine will. Like with his previous command post, he hoped for the usual office work. In the dark year of 990, M41, sympathizers of the treacherous Tau in the Deepwater system would have laid waste to Zeven's flagship with the Lord General aboard had not Cain, the Emperor's unwavering blade, intervened. And within a year, he was escorting reinforcements to Quadrividia, then besieged by the Tau, and was present when these Xenoscum called for a truce to combat the monstrous Hive Fleet Kraken. Cain then joined Zivan and a Tau emissary on Fecundia to orchestrate the defences of that world against the impending darkness. Cain found himself forging an unholy alliance with the Drukhari succubus as Tyrannid horrors descended upon the world both found themselves upon. The succubus, seeking to elevate her status within her depraved cult, sought to ensnare Cain. Yet it was she who underestimated the Commissar, for he outmaneuvered her in their duel of fates and ended her vile existence. In a decisive strike, he commanded an airstrike to obliterate the webway portal through which the witch cult had poured onto the planet, a blow against the dark forces that threaten mankind. Over the span of 80 years between the first and second sieges of this embattled world, Cain found himself embroiled in conflict on Purlia twice. The first ordeal unfolded during the campaign on Periremunda, where Cain unearthed that both the Ordo Xenos and the Adeptus Mechanicus were entwined in a clandestine project linked to an artifact known as the Shadowlight. This ancient artifact, predating the very existence of mankind, had the power to awaken the forces within hidden psychers and augment the powers of those already awakened, a formidable tool in the eternal war for the soul of the Imperium. Shadowlight was harboured within the secret sanctum of the Mechanicus, nestled in the dam within the Demon's Valley on the eastern continent of Purlia, until it was confiscated by a charlatan tech adept named Matthias, employed by Inquisitor Kilian of the Ordo Hereticus. When Cain arrived at the dam, shortly before its obliteration which flooded the valley and drowned thousands of orcs, he discovered that the tech priests of the sanctuary had been slain with surgical precision mere solar weeks prior. Later he uncovered that it was the machination of Kilian and Matthias, with Kilian mobilizing forces of the Adeptus Sororitas to storm the temple. The Inquisitor forged alliances with several chaos cults on Periremunda, intending to wield Shadowlight to amplify his psychic might, transforming them into unwitting servants of the Emperor. Kilian's grand scheme was to utilize the artifact to forge an army of psychers potent enough to storm the Eye of Terror, and to engage the forces of chaos on their own blighted soil. Upon the edict of Inquisitor Vale, Cain lent his aid in tracking down Kilian to his fortress within the Adeptus Sororitas convent on Periremunda. Having already undertaken several attempts to slay Cain, Kilian sought to win his trust as an ally. Yet upon discovering the deranged schemata of Kilian and his utilization of a captive lictor to lure an adjacent tyrannid swarm, thereby obscuring his own tracks, whilst heedlessly consigning vast numbers of civilians to slaughter as collateral in his escape plot, Cain rebuffed him and a shootout ensued. Amidst the chaos, Jurgen seized the Shadowlight, and Kilian, unaware that Jurgen was a psychic blank, erred in assuming that either Cain or the Mechanicus had discovered a method to deactivate the device. He wrested Shadowlight from Jurgen, attempting flight but was mortally struck by its full fury the moment he exited the range of Jurgen's abilities. Later, Matthias met his demise by Tyrannid during the evacuation from the monastery before Vale summoned an orbital bombardment to annihilate the Tyrannid. Following Kilian's death, the artifact was returned to the restored dam in the Valley of the Demon Hosts, where it was to remain for another 60 years. Another incident unfolded during the second siege of Purlia, in the year 999, M41. By this time, Cain had retired, making Purlia his abode and lecturing at the Schola Progenium on the western continent, in a mountain village not far from the planet's capital, Havensdown. When encountering rogue trader Aurelius, whom he had met on Gravelax, Cain learned of the approaching forces of chaos, which had engulfed two neighbouring star systems, setting their hellish sights upon Purlia. Cain harboured suspicions that the horde of chaos and their leader, War Master Varen the Undefeatable, had set their malevolent sights upon the Shadowlight artifact by the dark bidding of Abaddon the Despoiler. Called forth once again to defend Purlia, Cain coordinated his efforts with the commanders of planetary and system defense forces, manifesting in Pictcasts, calling upon the citizenry to join the militia and leading assaults on the cultists of chaos, culminating in a final confrontation against Varan himself. Although he succeeded in slaying Varan and ending the second siege, the artifact was seized by a cadre of Necron scouts, presumably to destroy it as psychers represented the most formidable weapon that could be wielded against them. From the actions of the Necrons, Cain and Vale surmised that the artifact might have been crafted by ancients intended to battle the Necron, who possessed a well-known dread of the warp and psychic forces. Ciaphas and Vale did not linger in sorrow, reasoning that if the Necrons harboured such fear of the artifact, they would unlikely wield it to the detriment of the Imperium, opting instead to conceal this weapon from the all-seeing gaze of chaos. Cain spent years post-service during the 13th Black Crusade, teaching at the Schola Progenium on Purlia, and penned his memoirs titled To Serve the Emperor, A Commissar's Life, and The Secret Cain Archive, which Inquisitor Vale distributed among her colleagues. In the grim darkness of the far future, amidst unceasing wars against the Shadow and the Warp, heroes like Commissar Ciaphas Cain emerge as beacons of hope and determination, their deeds becoming legend, forever enshrined in the archives of the Imperium. Apparently Cain perished somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century of the 42nd millennium, and he remains the only soul in the galaxy to be listed as active duty in the Imperial Guard, even after being interred with full military honours. It is of note that a peculiar sect within the ranks of the Talon Desert Raiders regiments of the Astra Militarum venerates Cain as a mortal vessel through which the divine will of the Emperor manifested. A religious manuscript dedicated to Cain, known as the Book of Cain, exists within the dogma of the imperial cult. This perhaps best encapsulates the legendary stature that Ciaphas Cain has achieved over the span of his existence.